Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Good Grief. My name is Dr. Christine Malone, and in this podcast, we talk about trauma, tragedy, and survival. In each episode, I will interview someone that has gone through grief in some way, and we will discuss the impact it has had on their life. By sharing these stories, we hope that others won't feel alone should they be going through similar situations. Enjoy. Okay, guests, thank you so much for joining me today. In today's podcast, I have a guest who's going to talk about the experience of losing her parent. So, guest, if you would introduce yourself and tell us a story about your parent.
Sure. Hi, audience. My name is Tamara Fox, and I actually live in Colorado. I lost my dad in April 2020. It was April 4th, 2020. So right when COVID had just started. My dad passed from cancer, but he had actually been a drug addict for, I want to say at least 10, if not 15 years, possibly more, prior to his cancer diagnosis and death.
So, was his drug addiction at all part of why he died, or he died from something else?
He died from cancer. Now, to me, I am a pretty firm believer as a health and wellness coach that how we treat our bodies has implications. So he kind of, to give some more background on my dad, he was one of those individuals who was one of the most successful people when I was a child. He was an actuary for a very prominent Medicare, Medicaid company. He made tons of money. He was one of those guys buying new cars in cash, like every couple months because he could. And we went to country clubs and we lived this very lush lifestyle because my dad was very financially successful and very did very well in his career. And he had a lot of surgeries in the 90s, like knee surgeries, shoulder surgeries from wear and tear and other just issues. And at that time, as many know, they would pass out pain pills like candy. So he would go through one surgery, need more, they'd continue to refill his prescriptions, and he never went off of them. So finally, when his surgeries were over, he couldn't get prescriptions any longer, he turned to buying drugs illegally in order to seek that pain pills addiction that he had created. And then after that, shortly after he could no longer purchase pain pills illegally, he had to turn to heroin. So I always say he's kind of that amazing success to almost homelessness story. He was almost homeless at that point. He didn't have a job. He couldn't keep jobs. He became pretty, for lack of better words, chaotic towards that part of his life because of what the drugs had done to his mental and physical health. So again, he was diagnosed with cancer much later on, and actually his life was starting to come around a few years prior to his death, which was really unfortunate. He had a job and was remarried, and his life was starting to get so much better. And then, he was diagnosed with cancer, but he suffered so many medical issues between the years of probably 2008 and 2020. And again, I contribute a lot of it to the way he had taken care of himself, but he was constantly battling different, both physical and mental health issues.
Yeah, I know. I'm so much that's it's such a common story with especially starting out with pain pills and then becoming all the way to heroin and near homelessness. And certainly speaks to, which I don't think anyone would argue, that the choices we make on our health throughout our life definitely has ramifications. And we'll catch up with you. Both of my parents passed at early ages due to health conditions. They just didn't take care of themselves, and they lived very unhealthy lifestyles. So yeah. So tell me a little bit about, I remember my experiences with COVID with my own healthcare and other issues, but I didn't have the loss of someone during that time. So how did COVID itself impact you with your father and maybe saying goodbye, travel restrictions, so on and so forth?
Yeah, so I think COVID was one of the many complicated pieces of his death. I had a pretty roller coaster relationship with my father most of my life because the drugs made him not who he was. As I mentioned before, it really impacted his mental health. It made him verbally abusive to the point where he would send me horrific texts or leave me horrific voicemails telling me what an awful person I was and just saying awful, awful things to me. And then the next day would completely not even remember it and send me a text and be like, hey, how are you? or call me and be like, what do you got going on? So again, the drugs and his mental health made him not who he was. And so our relationship was already on its ups and downs prior to COVID and prior to his death. And at one point I actually had to like kind of put a boundary around him, because he would every week text me with a new illness or a new ailment. And I was dealing with a lot of my own personal things at the time that I didn't really have the capacity to support him. And he was remarried to a wife. So I knew he did have a support system. And I shared with him a few years prior to his death. I said, listen, I love you and I support you, but I can't be your crutch. I can't be the person you go to every single time there's one little thing wrong at the doctor's. So I ask that unless it's something like big that we need to talk about and share, that you don't share every update with me. So prior to his death, I'd say about a year or two prior, we weren't very close. Again, we hadn't really been close most of my life, but we weren't talking as much because I did put a boundary up. And when he did die, I can't remember it. It's hard to recall if I even knew he was in the hospital. No, I did. I did know he was in the hospital leading up to his death. His wife had told either one of my brothers or me that he was in the hospital with cancer. And then all of a sudden he was gone. And we didn't really know what happened. And his wife couldn't really get answers. He was living in Houston at the time. They didn't allow his wife into the hospital because it was right when COVID had started. And we didn't know much. So we don't know how, when, et cetera. Did he go peacefully? Was it not peacefully? So there's a lot of questions we'll never have answered. And of course, given the time that it was April 4th, 2020, there was so much we couldn't do. We couldn't have a funeral. We couldn't really gather to honor him. I think we did some Zoom things with his family just to connect. And my brothers and I got together in person so we could at least be together physically. But it was almost like, hey, your dad's gone, but sit out your home by yourself and process it. And it brought up a lot of trauma as well when he died. I had this dual processing of I'm processing grief, but I'm also processing the trauma. I'm processing the verbal abuse and the things he had done my whole life. And it was unlike the grief of a grandparent that I experienced before, where you're just truly sad. I was sad and also processing a lot of trauma that had come back up. So it was a very interesting time to not only be alone, but to be processing something so heavy.
Yeah, I completely can relate to that. So without having I want to say you had a kind of a difficult relationship with your father, so it doesn't sound like you were able to resolve that, if you will, before he passed. So, and you just mentioned kind of, working through some of the trauma and that. Do you have regrets? Do you feel like there was something you could have done that you would like to have done if you could go back in time with Dad before he passed away, that would maybe have helped you with that feeling of going through the trauma when he did pass?
I don't, which is interesting. I think shortly after I had to forgive him a lot. I worked with, it was a therapist who told me, you have to forgive your dad for being the dad that he was. He did the best with what he knew and what he had, instead of being the dad that you wanted. And in many ways, when he died, I no longer was this little girl who was constantly waking up in the morning and hoping her dad would wake up and be the guy I always wanted him to be, because that had happened throughout the years. He was so hot and cold. Some days he was so phenomenal and great. And then the next day he's telling me what a piece of shit I am, pardon my language. But when he died, I finally released that piece of, he was the best dad he could be with what he had. He suffered a lot of mental health, not only in his adult years, but he struggled with it in his childhood as well. And I had to really grieve that. I had to grieve, my dad dying. I had to grieve, I had the dad that I didn't want, but that was the dad I received. And I had to also forgive him. So I did a lot of forgiveness work of, thank you for being the dad you could be and loving me in the ways you knew how, even if that wasn't what I wanted or expected. I still appreciated and forgave him for who he was.
Yeah, I completely understand that too. My mother and I had a very difficult relationship, if you will. And when she passed, I didn't talk to her before then. I didn't resolve a lot of things, and purposely, I just didn't feel I needed to. And I had to do the same thing you did, which was to forgive her for a lot of the things that she did and did not do as a
Yeah.
mom. So, any thoughts about? I know you're very young, so losing a parent when you're young, the things that where you would have him be there. So you get married and he's not there, or you have a child and he's not there. So those loss of memories. Did any of those things come up for you since he passed? Things that he's not going to be there for that you feel bad about?
Yeah, so I actually wrote about that in my blog, which I think that was one of the hardest things is, as I mentioned, my dad was on the up a couple years prior to his passing. He was remarried to a wonderful woman. He was getting his life on track in so many ways. He was no longer abusing the drugs. It was wonderful. I was seeing him turn over a new leaf in so many ways. And which enabled us to start to rebuild a relationship that had always been pretty rocky. And that was one of the first things I wrote about in my blog when I wrote about my dad passing was he wasn't going to get to see me get married. He wasn't going to ever meet grandchildren. And between either myself or my four brothers, and he always talked about how excited he was to be a grandfather and those things, and just experience other memories and events with us, especially seeing that he was in a much better place and starting to be in a really good place. So that was very difficult. I also, at the time, and I'm trying to think right now if I can recall, I don't believe, and I could be incorrect, but I don't believe I actually knew anyone who had lost a parent young. So I felt, again, a little bit alone of like, not only did I know that, envy in a lot of ways, some of my friends who had amazing fathers and these wonderful relationships with their fathers, but now I was at a place where I didn't have anyone else who knew what it felt like to lose a parent. I was, 2020, I was 28, 29 when it happened, and it was still really young. And I didn't know at that time, I didn't have anyone close to me who I could talk to who could relate to that loss.
Yeah, again, unfortunately too common, but people don't really have that available to them, or people don't feel comfortable talking to you about it too, maybe because they haven't experienced it. So I know you have, you mentioned your blog, so tell us the address of your blog, and I also want to hear a bit about, I know, the coaching that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So the address is a little long, so I'll send you the website address to put in your link for your viewers. But the blog and my health and wellness coaching is called Awaken Empowerment. The blog is about my life with the goal of one day, 5 years from now, I'll be writing a book about it. But it talks about what has happened to me and some of the experience I've had and what I've learned, gained, and how I've come out of those experiences in a better light. Again, I started the blog with the intent of hoping that others would read it and not feel alone, because in a lot of the experiences I have had, I've felt pretty alone. So that's why I started the blog. It's amazing. I love it. It's very therapeutic. And shortly after I started it, I did have people reach out and say, hey, I shared this with a friend. They found it helpful. And that to me made me feel like I was doing something that's making a difference, which is great. And then the health and wellness coaching for me is working with individuals who want to get from point A to point B or point C or whatever that may be, get somewhere into the future, but feel stuck. I oftentimes do work with a lot of individuals who have experienced trauma, but I'm not a therapist, and I'm not looking for people or I don't work with clients who are in need of therapy. I typically work with a lot of people who have either done therapy before or they're in therapy and they want something different, something more forward focused, something more solutions oriented, something to help them make them feel better in a different way. And I work with a lot of people who have never been in therapy, but know the power of coaching and the difference it can make in your life to have somebody, just that advocate in your corner and somebody helping hold you accountable. And as a health and wellness coach, I work with my clients on a holistic level. So looking at the whole person, whether that's physical, mental, spiritual, financial, whatever that may be, and determining what are their goals and what do they need to get there and how can I help them get there. And truly, it's not just me helping them get there. They are the captains of their own ship, and they truly find their way through whatever they need. But I'm there to hold space to help them get there and partner with them in that journey. But they're really the ones that contribute to all of their success.
Do you feel like the experiences that you've had in your life, specifically the traumatic ones, have helped you to be better as a health coach?
Yes. So I say to people that I meet often is I have 30 years of life or 60 years of life experience in 30 years because I've experienced seven deaths in 6 years and I had deaths prior to that. But from 2016 to 2022, I had 7 losses. I went through something extremely traumatic, which I know you and I have talked about when I was 19, which is another one of your podcasts. If your listeners haven't listened to that, where I talk about that. As well as some other life experiences. And when I've talked with others who are kind of in the grief or healing and trauma space, and they always say, wow, you have been through so much so young, where most people go through what you went through over the span of their entire life, or they go through maybe a tenth of what you go through at one point in their life, but not over such a substantial period of, that 12-year time. So I do believe 100% my experiences give me empathy for those who have gone through other difficult things. And if I cannot relate completely, it allows me to hold a lot of sympathy for them because I know what it's like to go through so much trauma, to go through grief, to go through hard times, and then come out the other side a person that you didn't imagine you could ever be. But that person can still be amazing. So I found it's been very helpful. And I often say I turned my pain into purpose.
Yeah, I can certainly hear that. And I think you would be very inspirational to people who are perhaps going through something or have gone through something and are trying to get their life in a space where I want to be. And now I've met this wonderful coach who is showing me by her own existence that there is definitely a path to take to where you can, be resilient again and so on. So I think that's great. I think you've definitely found a field that sounds like it's perfect for you.
Yeah, I love it. And I work with my own coach. One of the reasons I got into coaching is because I knew I didn't want to be a therapist. I didn't like the clinical reactions I got from therapists anytime I was seeing a therapist. They couldn't relate with me and say, I know what that feels like. I've been there. Here's something personal about me that I want to help you not feel alone. Therapists have to stick to the book. Their clients are not supposed to know much about them. They have to stick to a very clinical approach, which felt to me when I've gone through things, it felt cold at times and it felt very disconnected. Whereas a coach can sit there with you and hold the space together. They can share personal stories. They can enable you to know I'm not alone, which is why I went the coaching route as well, because I have a background in human resources. So I've worked with people my entire career. And I got into HR because I wanted to help people, but the coaching enables me to help people on a very personal level in that one-on-one space, which we all need. Like I'm a pretty firm believer of we all need a coach. We all need somebody helping us in our corner be the best version of ourselves we can be. So many executives have coaches, and oftentimes coaching kind of has a bad reputation that it means something's wrong with you. Whereas a lot of the most successful people in the world have coaches because it means something's right with them.
Yeah, no, I agree with that for sure. I do a lot of mentoring for young careers that going into healthcare, and I get a lot out of that too from that. We're not life coaching, but career coaching, and I really appreciate. Um, I actually think it's probably very fun for me, and so on. And I feel like I'm paying it forward, so that's always part of it as well. But any other things you'd like to share with us before we end this episode?
I think for those who have lost a parent, regardless of when, how, or what your relationship looked like, that there are ways to find healing in it that is very therapeutic for you. So for me, that healing was learning how to forgive, like truly, truly forgive, which is a life lesson that I think we all need. So even if you have the most beautiful, amazing relationship with the parent you lost, find what lesson you can take and learn from that and apply in your life and maybe even teach others and how that can impact you for the best. So that's all I would leave with.
Great advice. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It was wonderful to hear your story and get to know you. And as I mentioned, I find you very inspirational.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Good Grief. To hear more about my personal story, please pick up a copy of my book, The Day I Became the Spider Killer, a memoir of trauma, tragedy, and survival, available in paperback, Kindle, and Audible via Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online book retailers.